In November 2020, we went into a second lockdown. The summer was long gone, and this time I was outside doing my gymnastics training in the rain and gradually losing motivation. I had a light bulb moment, and for the first time I realised that my career was coming to an end. I didn't have any sponsors, I had a lack of a support network around me, I didn't have any education to fall back on, and I realised in that moment that I was going to have to make sure that my 20 years of experience was worth something going forward. The idea of a mentoring program was born, and this is my story. So back to 2020 in that November time, and when we went into that second lockdown, it was very different. You know, that April and that May, June, July in the summer when we were all off work and we were living at home, it was brilliant because the sun was shining and we had an amazing summer. But, you know, this November was almost like a shock back to reality. And I can remember I was living at my girlfriend's house. I'd moved in with her family. And I was now doing pommel horse and mushroom in their back garden on a wonky kind of like path outside in the rain, thinking, what on earth am I doing and how much longer can I continue to do this? And I think for the first time in my life, I really did feel like my back was against the wall, and I had a deep understanding that I was getting towards the end of my career. And even if I was going to get back and compete one more time and get back into the gym after this second lockdown, however long it was going to last, I didn't have that much longer left in gymnastics and within me. So yeah, it was quite scary actually. I felt very isolated and alone, and you know, I would sit in their house and they were incredible. They were so welcoming, and you know, I lived with them for 12 months and it was an amazing place to be. But it was really hard for me to be, you know, thinking, what do I do with my life right now? Like, what am I without gymnastics, and how do I fit into this world? And I wasn't on the GB team anymore, so that was difficult because I was having to accept that, you know, I wasn't technically good enough as an athlete, which is what I was at that point, to qualify myself to have funding, financial support, access to, you know, sports science. So yeah, it was a real tough time. I really struggled. I felt very much on my own, and I felt like, you know, these 20 years that I've done in gymnastics, they've got to be worth something. So I started to think about, what can I do? How can I turn that experience into something positive and also a career? You know, that was really important. I was going to have to learn to go out into the real world after gymnastics and make a living. And, you know, the only thing I'd known was gymnastics. So how could I potentially use that? And I guess what I had learned throughout my career was all these little tricks and tips, and I'd learned all of these things by basically making massive mistakes. So it was my job to try and learn from them and see if I could pass on that knowledge. And at that time, I realized that there were so many young people and young athletes feeling exactly the same as me. And I was kind of thinking about those boys and girls that weren't quite on the GB squad, so they weren't able to go to the gym yet, and they didn't have access to physios or that knowledge. But they were still, you know, they had hopes and dreams of one day representing Great Britain in a competition. I thought, how could I help those guys? So I set up something called the Wolfpack Mentoring Program, and it was basically putting in all the lessons and the things I'd learned, and in many ways kind of a life hacks into practice and giving back. And it was amazing. I set that up. I kind of built my own website, never done that before, and I got the word out there, and I got approached by lots of individuals, lots of young athletes, and also some clubs. And the first club that I worked with was a club called Corby Gymnastics Club. It was a girls' club. And my target audience, when I was kind of coming up with this idea, was probably like 17 to 18-year-old young men that were, you know, on the fringes and the edges of being on the GB national team. And I was going to try and come in and see if I could make the difference and fill a gap or a hole of maybe a bit of knowledge they were missing that would help them take that next step on to get into the GB team. So the first group of kids that I ended up working with were like a group of 8 to 14-year-old young girls that weren't necessarily aiming to be competing for Great Britain. So it was really interesting. It was like the polar opposite. But actually, I absolutely loved it. And what transpired and what followed was that I think in helping these young girls and going through this mentoring program that I built, it was actually something that became the framework that I used as I approached my gymnastics at the very end. And the cool thing about that, I guess, is that it really worked. So, it wasn't just this thing I was making up. There was some strong foundations to what I was saying and the things we were doing in the sessions and what we were working on. And yeah, the 4 key areas that I really focused on, the first one was building self-confidence. So when I sat down with this, I had 2 groups of girls. It was like nearly 15 young girls, and we sat down. The first thing I wanted to focus on is building up that self-confidence, because we were at a time where kids were out of the gym, they couldn't communicate with each other, everybody felt super isolated. I'm sure lots of the young kids were struggling to motivate themselves to do these Zoom call gymnastics sessions. Like, I've always said this, like looking back, if I was a kid in lockdown and I had to do schoolwork or gymnastics, it would have been a nightmare. I would have struggled massively just to sit down and concentrate and stick to it. And, it would have been really hard for me. I wouldn't have been stimulated by that, just being at home on your own situation. I need people around me, and, I need to be in an exciting, motivating environment. So I was like, how can I help these young girls? And the first thing that I started with was building self-confidence, because it really is the most important thing. And when I go back now, and when I really started to understand how important this was, I did some work with a sports psychologist. So I had a sports psychologist from the year, probably about 2014 to like 2017. And I kind of just dabbled with it initially. But really towards the end, we started to work on this concept called super strengths. And this was really cool. And I'd never heard it before until she told me about it. And what it was all about was essentially the opposite approach that I had to my gymnastics career. So when I was a kid, I never really focused on my strengths. I focused on my weaknesses. I just kind of let my strengths tick away in the background, but really tried to push myself on the things I was not good at. And I really focused on those, which is interesting looking back, that I never really pushed my strengths, but I guess that would come back to what my goal was. And for me, my goal was always to be the Olympic all-around champion. So I was trying to be the ultimate jack of all trades. And so what I would do is just really focus on my weaknesses. And she explained to me, look, I want to try with you, Sam, on focusing on your real strengths. And so she sat me down and she asked me, what do you think your strengths are? And it's so funny, like a lot of people, I think if you ask them to sit down and almost compliment themselves, they'd find it really hard. So with this group of girls, what I did initially was I got them all to be in a group, and I asked them to say something positive about one of their friends in the group. And it's really easy to do that. If you think about your best friend, or if I think about one of my best friends, let's say Andy, for example, and you ask me, like, what's one of Andy's amazing qualities? I'm like, well, Andy's always positive. He always looks at the bright side of life. And for me, that's amazing, because I understand just how hard that is to do that. I believe that positivity is a choice, right? So for me, that's massive. That's amazing. And if I was to think of a super strength of Andy's within a gymnastics context, I mean, he had incredible spatial awareness. And when we were kids, me and Andy would stay in the gym on Saturday afternoons and we'd play on trampoline for 3 hours, and we'd pretend that we were doing the knots open competition, and then once we did that, we'd do the British Championships and then the European Championships, and we'd literally commentate and dream of me and Andy competing at the Olympic Games while we were doing this trampoline competition. But he was so good and he was so fearless on the trampoline, and his spatial awareness massively helped him in his career. And I'd actually probably say, just thinking about it now, Andy is a perfect example of somebody that really focused on his super strengths. So because of his spatial awareness, because it was so good, he was so good on floor. He was amazing. And any things he did in his gymnastics that involved doing somersaults and twisting or being in the air, he was brilliant at. So high bar, dismounts off rings, whatever it was, anything where he was doing somersaults and he was using that skill of being amazing in the air, which he honed when he was training on trampoline when he was a kid, that was really his super strength. And a lot of the time, he probably didn't put so much focus on his weaknesses at light rings, because even at the end of his career, when Andy would go and compete at like the World Championships in 2018, he'd only train on the rings like 2 weeks before he went out to compete at the World Championships. So yeah, it's really interesting thinking about that. And when she explained this concept of super strengths to me. So yeah, getting the kids to think about some of the things that their teammates were really good at, or their real positive attributes or skills that they had, was super important to me. And then I would get them to talk about a gymnastics specific one, but also like a mental one. What's one of your mental super strengths? Because it's different for everybody. Some people are really good team players, you know. When people are down and struggling, they're really good at building morale and getting everybody to work hard. Some people are incredibly resilient and they're tough and they're strong. And when things go wrong, you look to them as a shining example. Or some kids are super brave. So you might be, as a group of kids in a gym, learning a new skill for the first time, and they're the kid that always puts their hand up to say, I'll go and try it first for everybody, you know? So yeah, getting the kids to focus on one of their friends was really important. And then what I did after that, once they had kind of, I think they had a bit of an understanding and I'd like broken the ice, I would then the week after get them to think about themselves and tell me what they felt one of their strengths was. And it worked really well. And when I think back to me, and when I would sit down and do this, you know, I always thought about what I would say when I was their age. So when I was a kid, what would I say my super strengths were? And when I look back to when I started gymnastics, I certainly think that my strength and my power was a massive super strength. My spatial awareness, I loved just doing trampoline and figuring out where I was in the air. I was a bit like a cat with 9 lives. I could always kind of get out of trouble. When I think about my mental super strengths, you know, I was incredibly tough and resilient. You know, I could always just seem to have this appetite for hard work, and I had incredible work ethic when I was a kid. So they were definitely real super strengths of mine. And when she explained this to me, the psychologist, and this idea and concept around super strengths, something just straight away, I just thought of Max. And, you know, when I look back to when I was 17, 18, and at that time I started to get some real success on the high bar, instead of like focusing on that as a real positive and thinking, wow, you know, I've just gone to a European Championships and I'm the 4th best high bar worker in Europe, maybe now's a good time to really push that and work really hard on high bar. And it doesn't mean that I didn't do that and I didn't work hard on high bar, but I then turned to my weaknesses again. And I went, but I'm not very strong on rings. So how can I get strong on rings? Like, I'm going to put all my energy into rings. And what I think Max did looking back, and I'd love to have this conversation with him one day, whether he did it on purpose or not, he realized he had a gift on pommel horse. And what he did was he really focused on that and he pushed that. And pommel horse was like a secret weapon, really, for gymnastics, because it's one of the hardest apparatus to perform on and to compete on, because you have to be incredibly good under pressure. It's like taking a penalty in a World Cup, or it's like doing the beam for women. It's very hard when you stand up there and you're on your own to keep level-headed and do a pommel horse routine. And Max, I think, like figured that out, and rather than putting all of his energy into 6 apparatus, he still worked on all the other apparatus really hard, but pommel horse was his thing. And what I started to figure out was, once he got once you get very good at one thing and you learn how to almost become one of the best in the game in one area, you can then apply that to somewhere else because you've learned how to learn. And the next thing that I kind of watched him do was, and if I was to say he had a second super strength, it was twisting. He was incredibly good at doing twisting skills in the air. And that's a perfect example of that is that Max's super strength at 18, you would say, if you had said, do you think Max could be an Olympic medalist on pommel horse? You'd say, yeah, 100%. But you probably wouldn't say that about floor, because I don't think naturally he had a lot of like physical power and strength, but he was incredibly good at twisting and he just maximized that to the point that he was even on rings doing a straight front 2.5 twist dismount. I've never seen anybody else ever do that dismount. And he figured out that he had this super strength. And I think once he learned how to get really good at pommel horse, he then turned to his next best strength, which was twisting, and he applied the same strategy there, and he went on to perform triple twisting Yuchenkos, winning an Olympic gold medal on floor. And for me, yeah, he's like the shining example of somebody that really identified their strengths and focused on that rather than their weaknesses. And I think when I look back at my career, I tried to be a jack of all trades all of the time. I was trying to split my time between 6 apparatus and be the very best on all 6. And actually that was impossible. You know, my body type was just never going to lend itself to being the perfect all-rounder. That's why the best guys in the world on rings struggle to do the high bar, and the best guys in the world on floor often struggle to do the pommel horse, for example, you know? It's tough because each apparatus requires different things and different physical body makeups, I guess. And I can remember having a conversation with a national coach after my injury at 21. I was coming back. I'd done all that rehab, and I was basically trying to do all of my rehab alongside all of my gymnastics training, and the two things were combining, and they were it was like a loggerheads moment where I could no longer keep up all of this rehab, but I felt like I needed to because I needed to protect my ankle, but also at the same time, I needed to add in 6 hours of gymnastics training. So what I did was try to do all of it. And so I was training 7, 8 hours a day, fitting in all this rehab and strength work and all these weights that I'd been lifting. And I was on the trampoline doing a landing session just on my own. And I think he was by the trampoline, and one of the older lads was on doing a vault session. And he kind of said to me, like, Sam, why are you doing all of this rehab? Like, you know, now you're back to full training. You should focus on, like, just your strengths and the gymnastics, you know, concentrate on high bar. And I kind of said to him, it's so funny, like, how it's very difficult to take your own advice. And then this is what I probably learned through my mentoring program, but I can remember saying to him clear as day, you are right. I agree with you, but you don't understand what I'm trying to do. And if you could see my dream and my vision in my head, you'd get what I was trying to do, which is it's mad. And I know what that was. I know what I meant. Like, in my head, I was thinking, right, I've got 2 years to try and become the Olympic all-around champion. I never said that out loud to anybody else, but that was my goal. That was it. I was trying to be the Olympic all-around champion. So, you know, for me, I felt like the only way I'm going to do that is if I'm as good as possible on everything, in every area and every aspect. And, in 2016, I came very close to representing Great Britain at the Olympic Games. You know, I was one of the first reserves for that team, but it wasn't quite enough. And I think at the end of my career and going through this mentoring process, what happened was, as I was talking to these girls and explaining these things, I was doing it for myself week by week. And I was thinking about, right, what are my super strengths right now at the age of, I think back then I was 27. What are they right now? Because that's very different to when I was 23. And I did that. I sat down and I worked out, what were my super strengths? What am I really good at? Mentally, what do I bring to the table? And I felt like that my real super strengths in gymnastics, and I think I identified 3 at the time, was the big one was high bar. I went, an apparatus, let's go for an apparatus. High bar is my thing. It's what I'm really good at. I know the high bar inside out. You know, no matter how fit or how injured I am, I can always prepare and do good work on the high bar. And I know how to perform under pressure on a high bar, because it's very different to all the other apparatus. Performing on a high bar is, you know, you've essentially, my routine at the time, I've got to let go 5 times and catch it again. And it's very different, you know, to warming up on the pommel horse and knowing how to get your 3-minute warm-up right. And there are so many variables with the high bar. The tension of the high bar and how much it bounces and how fast it is different on every single high bar. But I've spent my whole year learning that process. So, you know, I was almost like an expert at high bar. So I identified the high bar as my super strength. And then after that, I identified spatial awareness. So spatial awareness was that trampoline training I did with Andy when I was a kid, when I'd just go in there and it was just fun. It was never hard work. And when I spoke to these young girls that I worked with, and then clubs afterwards, and young kids that I did mentoring with when I was working at Knott's, I explained to them, like, think about the things in the gym that you enjoy the most. So what do you enjoy? And some of the kids would say, like, floor, I love floor, or, oh, I love rings. I'd say, when you're doing floor or you're doing rings, does it feel like hard work? And they're like, no. I was like, that's because you enjoy it. And when you enjoy something, it's really easy to work hard. And when you work hard, you get good at it. And I was like, okay, so for me, spatial awareness, when I was a kid, I loved it. Floor, vault, high bar, they were my favorite things, or doing dismounts, anything where I could do a somersault. So what I should have done growing up in my gymnastics was look for ways that I could incorporate those strengths as much as possible and play on my strengths, rather than thinking, God, I'm really weak here. I need to focus on this and try and build this up to where my strengths are. Because you can't do everything in the world, you know. I believe that I can do anything, but I can't do everything all at the same time. That's a really important lesson that I learned. So that spatial awareness was massive for me. So I was going to focus on the release and catches on high bar and the dismounts on the apparatus, you know, and my tumbling on floor. And I guess the other one that for me was a massive super strength was my ability to stick landings. You know, I loved sticking landings. There's no other feeling quite like doing an amazing routine, sticking a high bar dismount, and going from like completely in the zone and hearing nothing to like the roar of a crowd. There's nothing like it. It's the ultimate high. I've never experienced another feeling that gives me that instant high. It's just a course of energy like flowing through me. It's incredible. And I've been lucky enough to have that experience a few times in my career. So sticking landings was a massive one. And when I look back to when I was 21, just before that injury, that was one thing I almost became like known for. Like people just laugh, just like, he just sticks everything. But it was a real like thing I used to work on. I used to train at that. I can remember in the lead up to the Commonwealth Games, you know, I used to do every day, I'd do 3 dismounts off every single apparatus, and the goal was to try and stick 3 out of 3, which is really hard. It's hard to stick a landing in gymnastics, and it's funny, that plays on my other strength, my spatial awareness, knowing where I am in the air, when to open out, where the floor's going to be and how to land. And I can remember on parallel bars I used to do double pike dismount. I can remember one day sticking 9 out of 10 like double pikes and thinking, oh my God, that's an unbelievable like number. Wow, I'm really going to a whole nother level at this point. So remembering those things that I was really good at when I was younger and how I could use them now, but appreciating where I was at in my career. I was a little bit older, and I think one of the other super strengths that I really drew upon was my experience. I thought, wow, God, there's not many athletes, not many gymnasts that get to this point where they're 27, they're still doing it, and they've got all this experience to draw from. So that was a massive bonus for me, because it meant that, yes, I'm not able to do the amount of repetitions that I used to, but if I'm smart and I'm clever and I apply that to my gymnastics, maybe there won't be so many wasted goes and wasted opportunities in the gym, and I won't tire out as quickly. And that definitely became a thing towards the end of my career. I applied that to my training, and I've spoke about before, I would go to the high bar, and when I was 21, 22, 23, I might have 30, 40 goes on the high bar in a session. At 27, I was only having 5. But all 5 of those goes were brilliant most of the time. They were incredibly consistent because I'd take my time and really use all of my experience. So yeah, when I work with kids and I work with young people and athletes and I talk about building self-confidence, that's what we focus on, the super strengths. And focusing on your strengths, it doesn't mean that you neglect your weaknesses. You work on them, but it's like going into a fight, I guess. I'd imagine I've had the opportunity in my life to like communicate with a few people that are involved in combat sports, and I'm really interested about the balance between focusing on somebody else's strengths and what they're going to do to you, and forgetting and neglecting what you're good at. And I think it's about that. It's focusing on what you're good at and your strengths, because everybody brings something different to the table. If you think about when you were back at school and your whole class, there might be 30 kids in your class, but everybody's good at different subjects, you know? And yeah, for me, focusing on those super strengths was a really big thing. The next thing that I worked on when I do my mentoring program is goal setting. And goal setting is super important. And when I was a kid, I kind of misunderstood the difference between a dream and a goal. And I just set this massive, lofty, incredibly motivating and exciting goal of going to the Olympic Games and being the Olympic all-around champion, which in my sport is the ultimate. But I really should have kept that as like a dream and had lots of goals and stepping stones along the way. And I think at times in my career, I certainly did that. But many times that concept, that idea of if you were to sit me down and say, what are you trying to achieve next? It probably wouldn't be able to give you an answer. It would just be like, well, I'm trying to be the Olympic all-around champion. So obviously that means that I need to be the British champion, the European champion, the world. It was never specific enough. And I think the problem with making goals that are incredibly not out of reach, but incredibly far in the future, is that it can be very overwhelming. So that goal for me of going to the Olympic Games and being the Olympic all-around champion, so much of the time that would completely overwhelm me and make me feel incredibly anxious and actually really hinder my self-confidence, because I'd feel like I'm so far away from that. Like, how do I even get between me and this void that's in the gap of where I need to get to? So I think short-term goals are really, really important for keeping you motivated, for your self-confidence, but also giving you like evidence. You need evidence that you're doing well, right? Everybody, no matter what you're in, whatever work of life you're in, whether it's my girlfriend, for example, being a teacher at a school, or Sam being a photographer or videographer, or me being in the gym, or me coaching, everybody needs some feedback and evidence from the world that they're doing a good job, and setting yourself small goals that are they're just enough out of reach that they're going to keep you motivated to go in every day and put the hard work in. But they're not too big that you feel completely crippled and overwhelmed with how far you've got to go is really important. I think I started to understand this at the end, you know, and I would always write down things. I have always been like a journaler, and I would write down my training plans and stuff. But I started to get a lot clearer with what I would write down. And actually, you know, even last year, I think at the start of 2022, I wrote down a big list of goals of things I wanted to do in the year, and it's on my wardrobe. Bit like when I was a kid and I put that London 2012 Team GB Sam Oldham, my dad gave it to me, in the back of the wardrobe. I'd see that every day. And there's something really powerful about writing down your goals, because I think when you write something down in ink and you take it out of your head, it's like a contract you're making with yourself. So for me, that really helped. And, you know, at that time when I was working with the girls, you know, I explained this to them, and I got them to try and make short-term goals and long-term goals that incorporated their super strengths as well. Because I think that's really important. I wanted all of this mentoring program to interlink and to be, you know, I wanted there to be a common thread, and I wanted all of it to piece together. And for me, like, making sure that the goals that I'm setting really play to my strengths is super important. So at the time, you know, my goal was to get back and ultimately compete at a competition one more time. You know, and my strengths at that time were high bar, like I talked about. I identified that as my real super strength. I was like, okay, what goal can I set for high bar? Long-term goal, I set the goal to be the 2021 British high bar champion. I set that as my long-term goal. But my short-term goal wasn't that. My short-term goal was actually, can I get back to doing a 10-skill routine on the high bar? That was a big challenge for me. I didn't know whether I could do that. But it was something that was, you know, possible and attainable, but not, it was going to be really difficult, but it wasn't so far out of reach that it just made me feel like really low and disappointed when I went to the gym, and I just was so far away from this goal. I still had that dream of being the British champion. That's really cool, right? Because, you know, on them really, really tough days when you're struggling, you know, that helps you get out of bed, and it reminds you why you're putting all that hard work in. It's to have that long-term goal, but the short-term ones are the most important ones. And once you hit enough short-term goals, before you know it, you're going to be closer and closer to that big end goal that you've got. So those understanding like the measurement of goals is really important for me, and making sure that setting yourself short-term goals that don't demotivate you because they're too easy. They stretch you and they push you, but they're not so far out of reach and so far out of sight that you just end up feeling overwhelmed, demotivated, and you end up kind of giving up. But writing those things down on paper really worked for me. And yeah, I wrote that down on a piece of paper in 2021, but I want to be the British high bar champion. And it felt really good ticking that goal off. I was like, oh my God, I can't remember the last time I've like ticked a goal off, and like I actually said I said I'm going to try and do that, and I did it. Wow, this feels amazing. And actually, like, the process of getting there was the bit that I loved in the end. And I'd figured this out towards the end of my career. It wasn't the gold medal and the standing on the podium. It was the love of being able to work towards that goal that I really enjoyed. So yeah, understanding the difference between long-term goals and short-term goals is really important, I think. And for me, like I said, you know, I'd set that bar was so high. It was like as high as it could possibly be. So after that, I was always going to be disappointed and feel like I was so far away from that, especially when I began to, you know, increasingly get injured again and again and again, because every time I get injured, I'd feel like I was one rung on the ladder even lower and further back from that goal at the end. you know? Whereas if I just focused on, you know, what is realistic for me right now, I think that would have really, really helped me. So, yeah, understanding that is super important. Because in 2015, I went to the European Championships and I became the 6th best gymnast in Europe all around. But for me, because my goal was to go to the Olympic Games and win a gold medal, I never even I didn't even celebrate that. I didn't even appreciate that. I didn't even understand that that was a big achievement. So yeah, understanding that is super important and being really realistic with where you're at right now. Do you know what I mean? Where are you right now? Not where you want to be. It's amazing to have that, but be honest with yourself. Where am I right now? And what's a realistic goal for me to achieve? So that's super important. And the next thing I worked on with this group of young girls and then clubs and other young athletes that I've worked with, the next thing I go to is overcoming obstacles, because this is inevitable. Like, everybody is going to face obstacles, and how you react to these is super, super important. So when I was younger, and especially when I was in the middle of my career, you know, I kind of got to a point where these obstacles would floor me a lot of the time. And my response and my reaction to them was always an emotional one. I talk about emotion a lot, and it's because I'm still trying to apply it to my life. I'm a massively emotional person, and I find it really hard to take the emotion out of things and use my logical brain, because I've got lots of experience. I'm quite a smart kid, right? So if I use my brain, most of the time I can make really good decisions. And it's funny and it's interesting, when I give my friends advice, or if I give young athletes advice, I give them really good, logical, sound advice. But when it comes to me, that goes out the window and I jump straight to emotion. So for overcoming obstacles is all about taking the emotion out of it and being able to make a logical decision. That's really, really important. When you face an obstacle, understanding very quickly, okay, what is in my control? So when I was working with these girls, the one big thing that was completely out of our control was COVID. And like, I think everybody felt a real uncertainty around that time, and a feeling of just not being in control of what was going on in your life. You know, it's all well and good when you can go to the gym and you've got to think about your training, but when you can't even go to the gym and you've got no idea when you're going to compete next. And a lot of these young kids had a lot of anxiety about doing the next competition and when that was going to be and how they were going to feel going back to the gym, and what if I'm not going to be able to do the skills I did before, which are all the, you know, I was having the same thoughts. I was just 27 and had experienced a whole gymnastics career, but they were exactly the same. Those thoughts that they were having at 8, 9, 10 years old, I was having at 27. So it really worked because we could relate, and I was in the same position that they were in. But what I did was I came up with a concept called the My Island. And what it was all about was fundamentally understanding what you can control and you can't control. So I said to all these kids that I worked with, I want you to imagine that you've got an island, and it's your island. And on top of that island, you put a flag on that island. And on that flag is your reason why. It's the big reason, the reason why you're doing gymnastics, or you go to school. What is that reason why? And this island is yours. And on your beach, all your friends and family and the people that are important in your life can come to visit you on your island and spend time with you. And then you've got a harbour, and around that harbour is like the castle walls, all right? And that protects all the bad stuff from out there coming inside. But when you go out of those castle walls into the big open ocean, there's massive waves and sharks, and that's all the stuff you can't control out there. And so I got the girls to write this down and draw a picture of their island and think about what their reason why was. And I explained how, like, your reason why has to come from you. That's really important. You know, the amount of times throughout my career I've seen kids and athletes that, you know, I can see that they're being pushed. They're being pushed by parents or coaches. The motivation and the reason for being there in the gym isn't an intrinsic one. It's coming from somewhere external, and that never works in my experience. And I've experienced that myself. You know, there were times when I was basically doing gymnastics, pushing myself at times for other people, and because I was worried about other people's opinions, I wasn't thinking about, what am I doing this for? What do I want to do this for? So I explained this to these girls, and they'd think about their island, and they'd think about their best friends and, you know, their family, their coaches, and all the people playing around their island and in their harbour. And then I'd get them to think about the stuff that was out there right now in their life that they couldn't control, like COVID, like not having access to the gym, like not being able to talk to their friends, you know, like not knowing when they're going to do competitions again. And we broke them down and we said, okay, well, what can we do about that? So I thought about it in the context of my life right then at that point. And again, it was the same kind of thing. So I wasn't able to go to the gym. Right. Well, what can I do? What can I control in this situation? I can make sure that whenever the gyms do open again, I'm physically and mentally in the best place I can possibly be. So that when I get back, you know, I'm going to have a good head start. And it's not going to be as hard because I will be fit. I'll be in good shape. I will have done some training. I will have loaded my joints by doing some mushrooms so that when I get onto the pommel horse, it's only agony in my elbows for a week instead of 2 months. So I got them to really think about what can you control? And I think when an obstacle comes along, the 5 kind of steps that I think about, and they're really important, and I'd recommend anybody trying this, and I still do it to this day, is first you've got to identify that there's a problem, because the amount of times in my life that something's happened and I've just ignored the fact that it's going to be a massive obstacle for me to go over. That's massive, just identifying, right, there's an issue here, or I'm not okay, I'm struggling, I'm not feeling well, right. I need to have then the self-awareness of how am I feeling about that. Let's say, for instance, I've just injured my shoulder, like I did after the British Championships, my last ever competition. Okay, how do I feel about that? Well, I'm pretty sad, man. I'm pretty disappointed. I'm worried about how this is going to affect me doing exercise for the rest of my life, like how it's going to affect me going to the gym now. I know that I'm going to retire. I'm not going to be doing as much exercise. I know that I need to go to the gym and do exercise because it really helps my mental health. So how is it making me feeling? It's making me feel pretty down. I feel pretty low right now. That's really, really important. And I think the next thing that I learned was acceptance. And this one is a bit of this is a different one and maybe one you wouldn't anticipate, but accepting what's the worst case scenario in this situation. And that sounds pretty like glass half empty in terms of mindset and approach, but actually it's really helpful. What is the worst thing that's going to happen in this situation? Because quite often we catastrophize in our head, you know, what's going to happen and make it much worse than it actually is in the reality. And when we talk about it in a group and go, well, the worst thing that's going to happen now is that I'm just going to have to rehab my shoulder for 3 months. But after that, I'll get back to normal. And I know that I'm going to be able to lift some weights or throw a ball or whatever it might be, or go back to the gym and do some more gymnastics or support kids. It's really, the worst case scenario is that I can't do that. But that isn't going to happen. But accepting the worst case scenario is super important. I remember when I was a kid, there was a gymnast that I used to train with when I was like 16, 17. And he just... one day I was like, Max, why are you so negative? And it wasn't Max Whitlock, it was a different gymnast. I can remember because it was always just, everything was like, oh, that's not going to work. I'm not going to be able to do that. Oh, why are we doing this? And I was just like, what's going on? He said, well, it was funny because he was always negative, but his answer was like really positive. He was like, well, Sam, what I do is I just accept the worst case scenario and then I'm never disappointed. And I kind of thought, right, okay. But it's kind of a bit of that. It's accepting what is the worst case situation that could happen right now, because everything after that is going to be a bonus, and the chances are that isn't going to happen. So acceptance is massive. Understanding and awareness of what's going on. So understanding what you need to do to fix that. Okay, what can I do in this situation is really important, because there's lots that you can do in a situation. There's some stuff that you can't do, and that comes down to the control. What can I control? What can't I control in this situation? So those 5 things are super important. And after we've worked on overcoming obstacles, the last thing that I talk about is finding motivation. And this one's huge because, like, everybody struggles with motivation. And there's different places you can get motivation. For me, you know, I get a lot of motivation from stories. So stories can be anything from music, podcasts, films, books, your friends, family members, like stories of other people's journeys and how they overcame obstacles is massively motivating. It's certainly for me. Whenever I watch like sports films and stuff, or war films, I end up feeling like so motivated. I just want to go and hit the gym and train. So stories is a massive one. Success is another one. So a lot of people are motivated by accomplishments, results, money, status. That's another motivation. That's important, right? Because that motivates all of us. And it certainly has me in my career. The next one I'd say is probably insecurities. So, you know, there's been times in my career where I've been motivated by feeling like I don't fit in, or wanting to fit in, or jealousy, or wanting what someone else has got, you know. Insecurities is a huge one. And then the last one I'd say is probably like passion, and what comes into that is like being happy, sense of fulfillment, connection with people. Like all of these are like massive motivations, and you've got to draw on these when times get tough, and when whatever it is you're working to, and that goal that you've got, that long-term goal, you're going to face these obstacles along the way. And I think that's why it's really important that you have these things in place. You need to have strong self-confidence and awareness of what you're working towards, and build up those super strengths, and really understand yourself and what you're good at, what you're bringing to the table. You have to have some real clear goals, because those goals are going to help you when you feel demotivated. And if the goals are pushing you just enough, it's going to keep you going when times get hard, because you'll remember, I don't want to go to the gym today. Like for me, for example, today, Josh couldn't come with me to the gym, so I was going to be training on my own, and I find it a lot more difficult to get there on my own. So for example, I was a bit later getting there because I knew I wasn't tied into trying to make sure I arrived at the same time that Josh got there, because I have that responsibility. But I've got this goal that I'm working towards, and I'm quite close now, and that got me out of bed and got me to the gym, even though Josh wasn't going to be with me. So I got the work done. So having those goals is really, really important, and making sure that you're not making your goals too big and too overwhelming. That is super important. The next thing is overcoming obstacles and realizing that you're going to face challenges. That is inevitable. That's just life. So being able to deal with a challenge when it comes your way is massively important. And the first thing, the way in which you react to a challenge is the most important thing, and making sure that you're reacting and using your logical brain and thinking about it, breaking it down, whether that's writing it down on paper or trying what I explained, the My Island technique. Write that down on a piece of paper, draw an island, put your big flag on it. What's your reason why? Why are you doing whatever it is you've set out to do? Whether it's trying to go to the Olympics and win a gold medal, whether it's trying to pass your GCSE exams, whatever it might be, you need that strong reason why. Think about all the people in your life, your friends and your family, and the people that positively impact you. Think about people maybe in your life that don't necessarily positively impact your life, and think about who you're letting into that island. And then remember that the things that you can't control, they're way out there. You don't need to worry about them. You've got to look after your island and your people and your little environment. That's really important. And then finding that motivation. So draw inspiration and motivation from the world around you, whether that's stories, films, YouTube videos, podcasts, whether it's accomplishments of trying to get there to achieve you want to go there and win a gold medal, or whatever it might be. You've got a target to financially get yourself to a point where you're independent, whatever that might be. Use those things for different inspiration. But those 4 key areas, building self-confidence, goal setting, overcoming obstacles, and finding motivation have been massively important for me in my life. And actually building that mentoring program and working with that group of young girls, the gymnastics clubs, the individuals, and doing my gymnastics workshops, I've realized that, wow, this is something I need to apply to my life all the time. And it's relatable and to everybody. It's not just an athlete competing at the very highest level. Anybody can use this framework, and I'm really proud of it. And for me, it worked really well. And ultimately, what I had to do at the end of my career, in that moment, in November, when I felt like, what am I going to do? Nobody's going to help me here. I'm on my own. I'd realized that in my gymnastics career, I'd been doing it the wrong way. And actually, the scariest thing was to try and do it differently. And I used this framework to convince myself that I was going to try and do something a little bit different. And actually, I was going to be more positive. I was going to focus on my strengths. When a problem arose and came my way, I was going to think logically rather than reacting emotionally. And I was going to put myself first on what I wanted first. And ultimately, I decided that, I just wanted to be happy and enjoy my gymnastics. And if anything I was doing along that journey came into conflict with that, then I needed to make an adjustment, and it helped me massively. And what happened, coincidentally, was that I went on and did really, really well and performed incredibly well, but more than anything, absolutely loved that experience of building up for that last competition. And when I came to retire, the next day I just felt content and at peace. And, I had that epiphany of, I wish I'd done this 10 years earlier, but I guess that's what life's all about. So if through my experiences, I'm able to help some of you guys, learn from my mistakes and use that framework of the mentoring program that I do, of building self-confidence, goal setting, overcoming obstacles, and finding motivation, and use that in your own life. For me, that's something incredibly valuable that's came out of my career. And, I'm hoping and I want in the future to work with more young athletes. I still think I've got a lot to give. I've now, I've started this podcast. I'm doing it consistently. I'm going into schools. I really enjoy that work. I'm teaching my gymnastics now at David Lloyd. But the next thing that I want to work on and offer is mentoring again. I want to mentor young athletes. So, if there's anybody listening to this podcast, whether you're a gymnast or you're not a gymnast, or you're from Great Britain or you're not, if you'd like to get in touch with me and you're interested in some mentoring and working with me and working on some of these skills that I've spoke about today, please reach out to me. You've got my email address, samoldham93@aol.com. But yeah, thank you very much for listening to the podcast. I'm really enjoying it. It seems to be slowly building. The feedback's been overwhelmingly positive. Hopefully you're still taking value from it. And remember, we have new episodes releasing every single week on all the social media platforms, all the audio platforms, so Spotify, Apple, Google, and wherever you get your podcasts from. And we release the episode every week on YouTube as well. So if you can like and subscribe to the podcast, it makes a big difference. But more than anything, I appreciate the support. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and you've taken something from it, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you.